different agencies with different kinds of responsibilities. They're all well-meaning, but, you know, this just adds to the lag time, the cost, and the challenge of the end product coming out the way we'd like it to come out.
Perhaps we'd have to look at that.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, there are places, you know, Park and Planning has responsibility for NRI, FSD, you know, the kinds of things that go into landscaping. I think that I can certainly...
I mean, if there's state law, I mean, we can always look at our friends in the state to adjust the rules for us to achieve certain ends. And I just think, you know, sometimes we just have to get out of the box that we've created for ourselves. And maybe there's a better way, and that would actually kind of reduce some of these, the dollars that you're looking at, because you've already built in, I assume, other assumptions about what other people are going to do. I don't suggest that we could do anything much about WSSC, but certainly with respect to the relationship that you have with Park and Planning, since you're going to be in the same building, it wouldn't really be that hard to adjust how this all works.
So what we found, I mean, I think that what we found in our discussions with other agencies, particularly WSSC and Park and Planning, is that they really liked being part of the discussion. They like the things that are addressed and objectives of the IgCC. And I do think it's worth a discussion and to look at both of these and to see, are there areas that might make sense to shift over so that we can apply them as a code-based basis.
I think that would be worth giving that some thought. Mr. Bennett, and I'm not sure who you are. Mr. Nauman?
Mark Nauman. During our outreach,
and you're
with Permitting Services.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
During our outreach work on the code, we engaged WSSC very comprehensively, and they have a full buy-in on this with regards to Chapter 7 and water reuse and water resources. They are, however, looking to Montgomery County for guidance on water quality standards that would be acceptable to WSSC, especially for in-building water reuse. So our hope and plan was, once the IgCC was adopted and under enforcement, that we would then be able to engage Health and Human Services, DEP, and the state to be able to come up with a standard that would be acceptable to WSSC. Until such time, they are standing on the sideline, and they will address individual requests on a case-by-case basis for elevated water reuse in buildings, but no adoption across the board. So this is an ongoing conversation that we're having at the state level. The Maryland Green Building Council, I'm deeply engaged with them and their adoption process at the state level, as well as DEP and Park and Planning. So this is on our plate.
So you are talking about this. Well, that's,
yes, ma'am.
I think that's worth pursuing. Mr. Bennett, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I should say, to the credit of this proposal, many of the topics which are in fact redundant have either been moved to project elective status or eliminated altogether. And WSSC, of course, is one. Recycling is another. We have a 50% recycling rate already. That's what's mandated by the code, so it's simply not mentioned. And then, of course, you go to site development standards and stormwater and things of that kind. Maryland is the queen of stormwater management, right? So we don't need to take guidance from this for that. So this proposal, I think, begins to deal with that redundancy pretty constructively.
Yeah.
So don't be
well, that's good, and I would encourage you to look at things that should be done, and there's no reason why we can't make it happen through other means as well. So I think with the right policy direction, I really think it's incumbent upon us to start looking at how we do all these things in a different, more environmentally sensitive way. Thank you.
Mr. Elrich.
Let's see, we have Mr. Elrich up next.
So I want to thank you all for the work you've done on this so far. And I have a couple of questions, and I think I'll start with my general reservation about how far we go. When you showed your cost sheets, I think you correctly observed that if you're a flipper, then you may have an uncompetitive product on day one. But if you're not a flipper, then actually it pays for itself, and the payback is in, when anybody was talked about, what's the payback for your investment, you're looking at a 5 or 6 year window for a payback. I hardly see that as onerous. But more importantly, these buildings are going to last for 40 or 50 years. So what you put in place is not like what you put in place today, and it's okay if we don't meet more stringent energy requirements because it's just for today. But the truth is they're going to be sitting there for a very long time, and they're going to be sitting there increasingly as sort of symbols of what we could have done but didn't do against the climate change, which is bearing down upon us probably ever faster. I mean, most of what's happening, the headlines are, we were wrong, it's going to melt quicker, it's going to get hotter faster, it's going to get more hot than we previously anticipated. So I don't, as long as there's a reasonable payback, I don't personally have a problem with insisting on more, because I think that we have this other responsibility, something greater than being competitive with what they might let somebody build in Virginia, and something greater than, what's the general market for these, price for construction. I think we have a greater responsibility, and I would rather err on the side of the greater responsibility than am I competitive with construction in the jurisdiction that doesn't care about the environment as much as we're trying to care about the environment. That to me is another one of those races to the bottom that I don't like being in. But other than that, I mean, I do think one of my assumptions was with the code that if this became code-based, you'd have less need for other departmental interaction. I mean, if your code says, and I have some experience with this because I'm dealing with something myself, if the code says you're going to have an R40 roof and an R23 wall, and you're going to seal all your joints to X specification, and you have to do this and you have to do that, that's just what you have to build to. And so it seems to me the more things are in code, maybe this is to Nancy's point, the more stuff that's in code and that prescribes how you build, the less I need another agency to look at it or ponder it. I thought that was one of the good things that we were, trying to move in the direction of. So I hope, in fact, that we do look for further opportunities to streamline, because there's nothing anybody else should be able to say about things that are required to do. And the last comment I'll make is about Ralph's comment about we don't need another set of stormwater because we're I forget what phrase you used to describe queen. So I may agree that we're the queen, but I think there's been some interesting criticism of some of the things we require people to do and some of the conflicts that are inherent at that. And I continue to hear from people that you might be able to achieve your objective if you went about doing it in a somewhat different way, not from people. I'm not interested in the folks to say bag the objective, but there are people who have said we think we could do this another way. So I would, instead of saying I don't need to look at another set of regs, I'd actually look at another set of regs to see whether there's anything in there which achieves similar objectives that we have in a more rational, potentially less costly way. I think we should always look for better ways to improve our practices to achieve the same end at a reduced cost if that's possible. I mean, we should not, it's sort of like one of the beauties of the system when it works well is that price drives innovation. And if you can do it one way, somebody will try to find a way to accomplish the same thing for less in order to see you can meet your standard and not pay as much. So I hope we continue to robustly look at information that comes in and consider, are there better ways of accomplishing what it is we set out to accomplish? I think our goals are very laudable, and I think that, we adopt what we think is the best thing in any given period of time. But if there's new research and new information, we ought to be willing to take it in. So I'd read the Green Book, and maybe I'd reach your conclusion, and maybe I'd decide that there's something there that's better than what I'm doing today. I just want to be able to do that.
Okay, I just want to ask a couple of quick questions. First of all, with respect to the issue of competitiveness in the region, it was my understanding that the IgCC we were moving towards it being the standard in the field. Are we in a place where other local governments are declining to adopt the Green Buildings Code? Are we the only jurisdiction in the region moving in this direction?
Actually, Baltimore has adopted it, and as Mr. Bennett noted, we're not hearing good things back from how it is going. I think Mr. Nauman could probably speak to this more specifically. DC has adopted multiple pathways. The point really, from our the point I was trying to make really relates to getting the IECC in place and then moving the IgCC forward, because the IECC will apply across the board, and we think that will, as a mandate, and that will be very helpful. So, what about other areas?
Mark Nauman, DPS. As Diane alluded to, Baltimore City is the only other jurisdiction in the state of Maryland that has taken the IgCC approach. Howard County has talked about it but have not taken any steps toward it. The state of Maryland has adopted the IgCC with heavy amendments, and they have tried to defer at the state level of construction for colleges and state buildings, prisons, that kind of thing, to the regulations of the local jurisdiction. So they have approved our approach to the IgCC and are sort of given a blanket approval to schools, public schools, colleges, to be able to follow our lead on this. The adoption of the IgCC, along with other standards in Washington, D.C., is like comparing apples to oranges. Their built environment is far different than ours. They have a lot less green space than we do. So their approach, while it offers a lot of options, are not options that we would feel comfortable with here, because it would essentially take us back to lead-based certification that most people would follow as an option. So we would be potentially the leader in the region for doing this. I have communicated with 17 other states who have adopted the IgCC in some form. Most of them have just taken sections out of it, such as Chapter 4 for site development or energy. Nobody out of the jurisdictions and states that I've spoken with, no one has gone to the extent that we have with regard to doing a fiscal impact. They just took the steps that they felt comfortable with. And so not only in the region, but I'd say in the United States as a whole, we would be a leader in this.
And then, again, with respect to competitiveness, Mr. Sheveko pointed out it had always been my understanding that although there were upfront costs or transition costs, that a life cycle analysis of adopting all of these sustainability requirements should lead to long-run savings, and that should mitigate against the concern that somehow adopting these standards would place us at a disadvantage, because in the long run it's actually in the building owner's interest if you take a life cycle approach. Do you want to comment on that?
I'm not going to comment extensively, other than the fact that I do agree. I think that when you look at the research, it's very difficult to show something that is really affirmative on that. And we have looked extensively for research on that very point. The issue is, and again, it's over the long-term owners over the lifetime of a project are going to be able to recover it. But you can't look at that in a vacuum. I don't want to quibble about whether or not we need to do this. There's no doubt that we need to do this. We need to make our buildings more sustainable. I agree with what Mr. Elrich said. I think that what is in the news every single day is alarming. And so I completely agree with that. We also have to, we want to make it succeed. And some of the highest risks for projects is in the early years. And we hear much about the inability to get projects leased up and so forth. So, I think that we are on a good pathway to moving this forward. I think that getting this new code cycle with the IECC is really what we were looking for to help mandate it across the board. And then what we add to it with the IgCC will be very productive. And I do think that we'll be able to come up with something very, very good moving forward.
Well, thank you to all of you for keeping us informed here. This is a matter that council members are enormously interested in, and we'll look forward to acting in the fall based on the assurance we got from the director of DPS. I don't see any further questions or comments on this issue, so again, thank you very, very much to all of you for your input.